Buenos días, señoras y señores.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Welcome to this gathering that has been organized by the Elcano Reals Institute, and I'd like to thank Fundación Botín, the Botín Foundation, for their hospitality and for hosting us and for offering this wonderful venue to us, one of our favorite venues in Madrid. And today we're going to hold our very last event of 2023. It's been an intense year that has been marked, amongst other things, by the Spanish Presidency of the Council of the EU. And I'm delighted to be able to greet you together with Fabian Julig, who is Chief Economy and Chief Economist of the European Policy Center, which is one of the greatest think tanks in Europe, based in Brussels. And actually, the Elcano Real Institute, as many of you may know, also has a small branch, a small office in Brussels, and we share that space with the EPC. So I'd like to take this occasion to also say thanks to Fabian, first for having joined us here in Madrid in a complicated time of the year, right before Christmas, but most importantly for the collaboration that we've had over the last few years with the EPC. And earlier on we will discuss in that we hope that next year we will even emphasize more that collaboration, and we will try and push forward joint research projects. As you very well know, we're both going to be very brief, but as you very well know, we want to look back into the past and do some stock taken on the EU presidency, the Spanish presidency, and my personal view is that it has been a success. In May, we brought forward the elections, and many people were forecasting that the presidency would be a total disaster, but I think the fifth Spanish presidency has shown some things that the most senior in this room already knew, which is firstly that Spain always performs with the presidency. Our public service, our public officials are at a very high level, and I think they've been up to the mark. And I don't say that because we have civil servants with us and representatives from the ministries with us. As an observer, as someone who has been observing this for the last 30 years, I honestly believe that it's fair to mention it and fair to recognize it. In the last semester, I think we've also had some political struggles, but I don't think this has weakened our tasks and our role at the presidency. And over the course of the morning, we will discuss two sections. The first session is entitled Resilient and Competitive Europe. And under this heading, what we intend to do is to discuss topics such as the open strategic autonomy, the economic strategy of the EU, and we would like to discuss to what extent we have made progress on the EU agenda in the field of strengthening the European capacities in the sectors that I have just mentioned. And then in the second section, we will delve deeper into more institutional issues. It's entitled Deepened and Extended Europe. And here we will be discussing to what extent Europe is ready for the next extension. And we know that this is something unavoidable and it's going to happen. And we want to study what is it that we want to do so that the EU is ready for the next enlargement. What institutional reforms are essential and how to tackle them. What type of consensus there is amongst the 27 member states in doing these changes. And without further ado, I will now give the floor to Fabian. Once again, mentioning our gratitude for his presence and his collaboration with Instituto Elcano. And I'd like to thank you all for being here today.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and apologies, I don't speak Spanish, so I have to rely on the translation, but yes, very happy also for the cooperation with Elcano and hosting you also at the EPC. I think at a time like this, it's even more important to have cooperation between think tanks to connect also the debates in the member states to the debates in Brussels. And that's especially important with the presidency. So the project presidency on which we've cooperated, I think, has really very much helped to bring that debate forward. And I'm looking very much forward to continuing that with the last event of this presidency, but certainly not the last event of our cooperation. It's been a challenging presidency, but I would say it's a sign of the times. Any presidency now is challenging because we are facing major challenges. The perma-poly crisis, which has even within the last few months added another tragic dimension to it, with a second war which Europe is facing, where it is also impacting on a large range of different policy areas, including also our involvement in the first war, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We are facing major transitions. We're facing sustainability, technology, economic security, and we're going to go into a bit more detail in the discussions in a minute. But at the same time, we're also facing a much more fragmented and polarized world, domestically, at EU level, but also internationally. So it's a very challenging world we're in, and I think that is a world where think tanks are also called upon to provide analysis and provide recommendations on how to move forward. So very much looking forward to the discussion, and thank you again for the very good cooperation.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Yo ya me ausento y llamo a...
And I will now leave the floor, and I will call Ana Bosch, Sara Baliña, and Miguel Otero for them to join us on stage. Thank you very much.
Hola, buenos días.
Hello and good morning once again. Charles already did the introductions, so I will just introduce the panelists that are going to take part in this, not really roundtable, but rather an exchange of impressions, and I hope a discussion too. And we will try and do it so that the first session can be divided into 3 sections in 3/3, and we hope that they will be more or less the same. The first one would last half an hour, and in this 1/3, we will allow the different panelists to do an introductory round, roughly 7 minutes. That would add up to roughly half an hour. And then I'd like for the 3 present here, and also colleagues who are joining us from The Hague, welcome, and thank you for joining us. We hope that you can also interact and that there's a bit of a discussion. And then finally, in the Q&A, we will also hear the questions from the audience here in the room. We are going to give the floor following an alphabetic order.
You'll be the last one.
Always.
Yeah, sorry. Así que va a hablar primero.
So we will then give the floor to Sara Baliña, who has recently been promoted. She is now the Deputy Director of the office that includes the word perspective and strategy in the government of Spain. So that means that she has been in the thick of it, in the core of this presidency, and she will also be part of the core of this first session today. And then we'll give the floor to Miguel Otero, who is someone who works with us at Elcano. For many of you, he is a frequent speaker in our events, someone who we read very often, and he is quite on point in this panel because for many years he's been focusing on globalization and the implications that this has for Europe, international relationships, economy, etc., and that crossroads too. So it's great to have him. Fabian Zuleg has already been introduced by Charles, and then we also have a fourth guest. He's not physically with us.
List from The Hague, desde La Haya.
From The Hague, we have a participant from the Netherlands representing another think tank. We have 3 think tanks represented here. Now we're talking about the Netherlands Institute of International Relations. And I hope that I pronounce your name right. Rem Kurtek? Is that Rem Kurtek? No?
Good enough.
Good enough. Okay, good enough. Un aprobado raspado.
Almost passed the test, almost. Okay, so after that, we will give the floor to Sala Baliña, and you will have the floor for 7 minutes. Perfect. Firstly, I'd like to thank everyone who's attending this session. And I'd like to thank the Elcano for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to address you all in this time that we have to discuss. And I would like to tackle one of the main building blocks of the Spanish Presidency, which is the analysis of open strategic autonomy. It's not a new topic, but from the Office of Prospective Strategy in collaboration with the 27 member states and technical teams that are very well acquainted with this subject matter in the different ministries that have been part of this discussion, what we've tried to do is to perform an analysis with a more prospective vision and trying to anticipate this terminology, open strategic autonomy. And it's important to focus on the reinterpretation of this concept, and as portrayed in the report that we published a few months ago, Resilient You, what we try and do is to really come to understand what open strategic autonomy means to improve our resilience, the capacity for Europe to adapt to the context. And I think the breeding ground for this discussion is very timely, and I think later on we will have the chance to delve deeper into this. We are not in a scenario of deglobalization or break of trade relationships between the main economic blocs. Evidence it doesn't point in that direction so far, but I think that we are facing up to a new way of understanding trade relationships, geopolitical relationships. From that perspective, from that new way of understanding the world, I think Europe has done an adequate exercise, and is indeed what we're trying to do to determine how Europe should be positioned before this. In the times of globalization, one of the main variables in the decision-making of the trade sector when they traded or invested, one key concept was relative cost. It doesn't mean that it's not still a relevant variable, but the pandemic, the war on Ukraine, and the context is going to show that there's other variables that are part of the equation that have come in with great force. Here we can talk about supply chain resilience, because there can be a shock on the supply chain for the basic goods, for the basic commodities, and there's many examples of this, ranging from chips to main medication and also some food that can suffer great shocks, as we have seen. And then we've seen that the scenario is also changing because of the underties that Fabian alluded to, such as, for instance, the environmental transition, the digital transition, and something that is often unmentioned, but it's also very important for Europe, which is demographic aging, because this has great implications for many sectors, including, for instance, the healthcare sectors, the healthcare industry. And this is part of the backdrop for our reflection, which is portrayed on the report. We need to transition towards this new context in which we need to better understand resilience and competitiveness, and perhaps in a different way compared to what we understood before. And one of the things that we try to do in this work is to deviate from that dichotomy, the difference between the openness, which is currently understood as a source of vulnerability, and in the past it was almost the opposite. It was a source of stability, to be part of global supply chains, very much intertwined, very much complex. and trying to fall back and actually produce in-house what we were exporting in the past, that was a way of going about resilience to deal with external shocks. This dichotomy has evolved, in our opinion, and it's no longer applicable. And what we're trying to defend is that for Europe to improve in terms of resilience and competitiveness in the mid and long run, and now we could be talking about a side note which could focus on gaps that separate us from countries like China and the US in critical environments that have been greatly analyzed. But the idea here is that there's not one single bullet. Europe cannot place all its chips on, for instance, a strong reindustrialization of the productive fabric, but that's obviously one of the building blocks that we need to work on. But others need to add it to the equation so that we can get to a better point, to a better position. And later on, I imagine that we will have time to discuss this in greater depth. But I'd like to focus on one of the fields that we have identified as most important to improve the resilience of Europe in the mid and long run. I think that sometimes we do an analysis based on the weaknesses and the deficiencies that we detect in the current time, because, for instance, there's goods and services that were important from the outside. There's services that are provided by companies that are purely abroad. We don't have a critical mass for that in Europe. Or because simply we believe that we don't have the capacity to replace those imports with national products. And something that I'd like to emphasize here is that we need to look beyond that and analyze the vulnerabilities that we could have going forward in the future, and not replace the current vulnerabilities by future vulnerabilities just because we are in a way exchanging cards here. We need to consider what issues could emerge in the future. We need to be ready for that, and we need to start preparing for that already now. I could set very illustrative examples. If you take a snapshot of the position of Europe in 4 areas that are essential for citizens' well-being: technology, digital services, food, or healthcare, and in particular the provision of some medications, we come to realize that there's countries that are providing more than 80% of some basic goods that are part of our day-to-day. The active principles in omeprazole or in many other drugs are imported from China and Asia, where production processes have been delocalized vastly. And actually the world of cattle raising, a good share of what feeds that cattle is imported from countries outside of Europe. And if we talk about digital technologies and green technologies, that reflection is perhaps more well known, and you can go to any chain of the production, any link of the production chain to detect vulnerabilities. We need to do that analysis. It's necessary, but we need to look beyond that too, because we may be missing out on some opportunities because we're not focusing on the next wave of innovation. So one of the conclusions of the report is that the solution to many of Europe's problems is not in the currently available technology, it's in the next wave, and Europe can do a lot of things about that. Yesterday I read in the news that there's a strong race between Taiwan, Korea and the United States to get a hold of the new generation of microchips, 2 nanometers or less, and Europe needs to position itself in a way that we need to have minimum production capacities here, so otherwise we will be left outside of that new wave. You just have 1 minute. Okay, in 1 minute I will wrap up. But I think it's a very clear example of a good that it's well identified, but a way to improve our resilience in a key sector such as cattle raising would be finding alternative sources to feed our animal productions. And for instance, there is work that's been done on algae and insects so that we can get a hold of animal feed. So what I mean to say by this is that this is one of the working lines that would like to underline in the report to break away from the perception that this is a status quo and it's difficult to separate from it. Improving our internal capacity for production, it's one of the backbones for this and one of the keys to improve our open strategic economy and autonomy. And I'd like to wrap up with this. There's 2 essential elements that are sometimes under our radar. One is to utilize the environmental transition and in particular using best our resources to improve our resilience. of the dust. We consider the green transition as a way to just fight climate change, but it's a clear way to trigger efficiencies and to reduce vulnerabilities. We need to be autonomous for a good cause. And there's another element, going back to the antagonism in which we began this conversation, talking about autonomy and openness and internal production capacities. Europe cannot afford the luxury of giving up the regional component for many years. The external trade has had more importance on its economy even before the crisis of 2008 and 2012. We need to rethink our position in the world, and this is a key element. And another point is that diversifying supply sources is something that will offer great richness. Oftentimes we talk about the Global South as great providers of raw materials for the economic and green transitions, but if you lift your gaze, you will see opportunities in Australia, Canada, or even within Europe. So that was one last message that I hope that we will continue to expand on. And sorry for taking too much time. Just with the backbone, the tree trunk and the branches that Sara Baliño has pointed out, we could spend the whole morning, because I think that branches could lead to even more ramifications, more branches. But as you were talking about this, about the fact that we need to be more autonomous and sovereign in a way from the standpoint of economy and production, when you were talking about that, I was thinking that this can be two drivers that are happening in Europe, not just in economy, but also in politics too, and in terms of policy. There's a new wave after decades of hearing about the European project, transferring competences and being in a group. There are forces that are trying to pull in a different direction and gaining back our political sovereignty. So,
y ahora vamos con
after going to The Hague, we will hear Rem Korteweg, and again, apologies for mispronouncing your name, representing the International Institute for Research of the Netherlands, and he precisely specializes in these aspects that we're facing in Europe, and the cross reference between trade, international relationships, and security.
some 7-8 minutes, no more than that.
I'll try to keep it to 7 minutes. Thank you very much, Anna. It's a great pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, I could not join you in person. But it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. And it's really quite interesting to follow on from Sarah's initial remarks, because I think Sarah made a very excellent expose of what the Spanish presidency has been working on. I also want to commend the Spanish presidency for its efforts to move the discussion on open strategic autonomy forward. And before I jump in with my reflections, let me also give a warm word of congratulations to the Royal Elcano Institute, to Charles, Ignacio, Miguel, and colleagues for being such terrific knowledge partners during this presidency. And it's been a great pleasure from the Klingendahl Institute in the Netherlands to continue our cooperation with the Royal Elcano Institute. And I mention this because it's worth reminding that a few years ago, the Spanish and Dutch governments published a non-paper making the pitch for open strategic autonomy. And I'm proud to say that both the Royal Elcano Institute and, in a very limited way, the Klingendahl Institute and my colleagues played a small role in moving that discussion forward. But it's very interesting to see that a few years ago, the Netherlands and Spain really put open strategic autonomy on the agenda, and to see where we are now. And like Sarah mentioned, if you look at what the Spanish presidency has been doing, particularly the publication of this paper, Resilient EU 2030, you can argue that open strategic autonomy has really become an accepted concept in a European context, that we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of how to think about, but also how to implement open strategic autonomy. And I think that's a very important benchmark and a very important result of this Spanish presidency. So I want to give a very warm word of thanks and congratulations to the Spanish presidency for having taken those steps. And I think, again, Sarah also mentioned this in her opening remarks. The trick with open strategic autonomy is, of course, how do you balance something that isn't really a dichotomy? How do you balance openness with autonomy? I think the guiding principle that we've come to realize over the past couple of months with think tanks, but also with the support of the Spanish government, is that open strategic autonomy basically means with trade relations, with economic security, you want to be as multilateral as possible, but unilateral and develop unilateral capacities where necessary. And I think, again, if you look at Resilient EU 2030, this is very much a guiding concept in that document. And I think it's become widely accepted that, again, multilateral where possible, unilateral where necessary, really is the guiding theme for moving open strategic autonomy forward. Now, just a couple of observations. First of all, I think what we've seen over the past couple of months, particularly in the political sphere, as well as in general reporting about open strategic autonomy, the focus has been very much on both promote and protect. So protect when it comes to new tools for the European Commission, whether it's inbound investment screening, trade defense instruments, export guidelines, the new anti-coercion instrument that was adopted. A lot of attention has been going to these new tools that the EU needs to have, and also on the type of support that needs to be given to specific sectors. But I would argue that the openness element of open strategic autonomy deserves our full attention as well. And actually, under the radar, a lot of things have been happening. There has been a broader discussion about the necessity for diversification. Sarah also mentioned it. We've also seen over the past 6 months, new trade agreements being negotiated and actually reaching fruition. Just look at the EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, yesterday's announcement of the EU-Kenya Economic Partnership Agreement, the discussions that have been opened between the EU and South Korea regarding a digital agreement. And all these are really important steps to ensure that we do not just focus on the defensive side of open strategic autonomy, but also really branch out to do the partnering bit, where we really need to reach out to other trade partners to establish secure supply chains and to think about, like Sarah said, not deglobalization, but reglobalization, ensuring that trade ties are secure, that they add to our resilience rather than to creating unwanted dependencies. But a number of issues still remain to be dealt with. May I just mention EU-Mercosur? It's quite, frustrating in a way to see that EU-Mercosur is still stalled and may actually, we see a closing window of opportunity also in the political sphere, and this I think is problematic. And I think also with an eye to the upcoming MC13 WTO Ministerial Council, which is just around the corner, there's a lot of work still to be done to make the case for open strategic autonomy in a WTO context. Let me also make a couple of observations regarding economic security, because economic security and open strategic autonomy go hand in hand. One of the real results of this presidency has been the identification of 10 technology groups that deserve sort of special attention from an economic security point of view. And within those 10, 4 have been specifically identified to go through a period of a European economic security risk assessment. Now, this is really difficult to do at the EU level and with the 27 member states, because what we're asking the EU to do is to establish a common approach to advanced technology development and to establish a common EU-wide response to how we deal with these sectors. And just to mention them, the 4 that have been identified are advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence technologies, quantum technologies, and biotechnologies. Basically, again, what Sarah said, it's the leading edge of technology development. And this, I think, is really the homework that the Spanish presidency has given the upcoming presidency to work on, is how you do that security risk assessment. And it'll be very interesting to see how that's going to move forward. Also, what's going to come out of the late January communication from the Commission because the work, of course, is taking place. But to me, this is really where the rubber hits the road. How do you do economic security risk assessments with an EU as diverse as the one we see today? Let me finish with 4 quick points of concentration where I think we need to focus on when it comes to doing economic security. Very quickly. One is, and I've captured them along 4 C's. So the 4 C's of economic security that I see. One is we need to have a discussion about whether we have the right capabilities. Yes, we've established the anti-coercion instrument, but we also know there's an upcoming debate about outbound investment screening. And we are really only scratching the surface yet of how to do outbound investment screening without undermining the openness we hold so dear. And of course, the US is offering some examples, but we really need to pick up speed when it comes to understanding what outbound investment screening at an EU level would look like. Secondly, the second C is capacity. Do we have the economic intelligence capacities in our respective governments to fully understand supply chains, supply chain resilience, supply chain dependencies, and investment flows? And this is a question where you're going to see a lot of differentiation between the individual member states. Some are better prepared than others. The third C is competence. Who has the competence within the EU, but also between the EU level and the member state level to really drive the debate about economic security and economic security risk assessments forward? Which commissioners deal with economic security? Who's in charge? And how does the EU level relate to individual member state level? Because I can tell you from a Dutch perspective, the Netherlands is moving forward with this, regardless of what's happening at the EU level. And there needs to be an element of, and this is my final C, of coordination. We really need to put a lot of attention into coordinating economic security policies. How to coordinate, what kind of formats do we establish? Are the working group systems that we have right now sufficient or not? Do we need something else? We really need to think about the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of doing economic security. And this is my final point, and then I will shut up, Anna, I'm sorry. We cannot do this by governments alone. The private sector must be an integral part of this conversation. In order to really move open strategic autonomy forward, it is crucial that governments work hand in glove with the private sector, because ultimately, governments set the contours of policy. But businesses and the private sector are the ones that actually have to implement and enact it. They are the ones that are going to provide us with that resilience we need. Thank you very much.
Dank u. Dank u.
Graag gedaan.
Y seguimos.
Let's continue with Miguel Otero. After this alphabetic order, now it's your turn. Speaking about coordination, this was not coordinated, but here we have Sara Baleña. She has set out the tasks presented by the Spanish Presidency. And then Rem Korteweg, these tasks, he has started to label them and to propose challenges to them, pros and cons, and to tell us where the potential obstacles may be. Now it's Miguel Otero's turn. You can now continue filling in this set of objectives in the long term for the Spanish Presidency. Okay, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here today and speak about this topic. I would also like to congratulate the Spanish Presidency of the Council of the EU for its work, especially Diego and Sarah, because of their coordinating role. I know she was coordinated with the rest of the 26 member states of the EU, and I think it is really marvelous. There is so much topics and subject matter. I would like to recommend you to read the document they presented because it's really worth it, and many think tanks in Europe have had a positive impression. By the way, Charles, Fabian and Rem and others, even Nathalie Docci, some other analysts from European think tanks from Italy, Poland, etc. They've had an article in Project Syndicate discussing or mentioning the most positive parts of the missing elements in this document, and I believe that, as Rem said, it's moved forward a lot in terms of the discussion on this very important matter. Since I have 7 minutes, I will present 7 ideas on a very brief manner to bring some more balls into our Christmas tree that we are creating, because some of them are, well, important. Maybe some of them are for context and some others are more practical. First, and you will have to excuse me because the political experts and the economists love these matters, but the EU is facing a new trilemma because it's difficult to achieve these 3 angles in the triangle. How is this trilemma? Well, first we have the green transition, making our economies green, reaching this goal of 0 emissions by the mid of the century. We are not doing so well according to the last estimates published today, but it's important. It's a clear objective with certain resistance from the political arena, but it's a goal we should all pursue. Second is economic security, and this is something Rems explained. It has several implications about, for example, reindustrialization, bringing part, at least, of the production to Europe back again. So it's an industrial policy, we could call it that way. And the last one, which is what the German loves and the Dutch love, and here we have one of them, is fiscal discipline, tax discipline. Can we achieve these 3 angles of the triangle? Well, it's difficult. It seems that the United States, with the IRA, has decided to go for the 2 first, and the third one has been left aside with a public deficit that will be around 7% this year. So the Stability Compact for the United States will quickly be included into a correction mechanism, should be included in a correction mechanism. But we have to think about it and think about how to deal with the fiscal capacity we have at the EU to achieve the 2 first goals. And I think this can only be achieved with a centralized fiscal coordination. And this is another milestone about the document presented by the Forecasting Office. Maybe we need an industrial policy, this is what they say, or a policy to cover public goods in Europe. And we at the economy area, we have been reflecting upon these subject matters for a long time, and we're going to publish a policy paper in January with a diagnosis that's been presented, but also with specific recommendations. And I would like to tell you some of them in the few minutes I have for this. One of them, and I think it's the most important one, is the fact that we need a federal budget, we could call it that way, or a fiscal union, fiscal capability. Yesterday I spoke to Fabian, and we are one of the few that really believe this is a good idea. But why should we do this? Well, first, some may think that the United States can afford the luxury of not having this kind of fiscal policy because they have the dollar. There's always a demand for dollars, and they can have this deficit of 7%. But it turns out that the European Union issues the second currency by excellence, and there's a long journey. But for that we need to do it together, to do it in common. We have the EU Next Generation, we have many public goods that need to be covered for green transition, for economic security that we want to develop. And in order to do so, we would be issuing what we call an asset free of risk, a risk-free asset. This would be a kind of European bond similar to the US bond that could consecrate this tax union or fiscal union that we have to develop. I think it's very difficult to achieve the banking union with European banks if we do not have this element, this fiscal sustaining element that would become the risk-free asset. And this would lead us to complete the service market. We need a scale that is necessary to compete against the US and China, and in order to do so, we need to go deeper into our service market. Third element is the European industrial policy. We can see that we have more and more state intervention with subsidies. The IRA in the US is a clear example, but also in Europe, where there's been a freeze of state subsidies. It is going to be present in the green transition, in the digital transition. So we see there are distortions because those countries that have more capabilities, such as Germany or France, can help their companies a lot more than others, and this generates distortions in the market, and the only way to avoid this is with this fiscal capacity that I'm speaking about. We also believe that we need to improve our regulations. Many of the companies are telling us there is an over-regulation and excess regulation. It should be smarter. That's what they tell us. We cannot create more European regulation and not to reduce the national regulations only, or the gold plating, as they say in English. There's regulations coming from Europe, and then the countries add up more regulations nationwide, and it generates an accumulation of regulations, and this is counterproductive. Fourth point, it's already been mentioned by Sarah and Rem. Europe needs to go for technology disruptions. Europe needs to have a context, a framework that should lead us for new innovations, new technologies to also be implemented in Europe. And here we should go for deep tech. We should go for tax incentives for innovation in Europe. There's still very little investment in innovation and development if we compare with the US and China in the public sphere as well as in the private sphere. And this is troublesome. We should go for the next big things with clear missions. We need to improve that in Europe, but all of us who are involved in research and science, we believe it is excessively bureaucratic. We need frameworks where we can foster innovation on a more agile way than we have now. Fifth point, Rem mentioned this already. This is about the public-private partnerships. When we speak about industrial policies not working, well, this was something from the past, and in the past it generated overthrown, it generated distortions. So, well, of course, we have to learn from the past, and we have to develop an industrial policy or an industrial strategy that should be public and private, with this public and private partnership. And we need this collaboration. We may need a more horizontal industrial policy instead of vertical. It's not about supporting specific companies or sectors or industries, but more horizontal in the sense that we will have a better context, a better regulation, or capabilities that Rem was mentioning as cross-cutting. Data governance, the use of data. Where is our data stored? How are they shared? This is a key issue for a large part of this disruption, for healthcare, for critical infrastructures. I believe we can take enormous leaps. There are big steps taken for digitalization of the economy, for example, in China, and I believe Europe needs to do that too. And within the horizontal industrial policy, we need to include training and education. Here we see asymmetries. In the last PISA report, we can attest this. We do not need for Brussels to decide national education or training, but we need support with, for example, digital platforms at EU level that would help many people have access to certain capabilities and skills that are necessary. And finally, I will finish here, all the international context. Sarah also mentioned this in the report, a new multilateralism. Maybe we should reform the World Trade Organization, taking into account this new reality where we will have more participation from the state, more industrial policies, and trying to open up the Chinese market to find a balance. and a better access to the Chinese market, and not coming into block dynamics or democracies versus autocracies with larger fragmentation, because history shows us that if you close, you fold up into yourself, you do not want to have trade relationships, in the end you may accelerate the decline. If the EU is in decline, my answer is always, well, Italy has been like that since the Roman Empire and continues to be one of the most modern and industrialized countries around the world. So managing this decline is important, but believing in our strengths, as the report from Sarah's office expresses this. I think this is important at this point. Thank you so much, Miguel, for your 7 key elements. You were speaking about the need to invest. This is something Rem also mentioned, the importance about investing. I also have in mind, we all depend on clouds, on platforms that manage these data. These are usually in the United States, and the generations are now in TikTok. All the rest of the social media may not be relevant anymore. I follow this very closely as a journalist because in the US and also in Europe, we can see that more than 1/3 of people under 30 get informed, not entertained, but get informed through TikTok. And this is not European, this is China. So in terms of innovation and technology disruptions, we are in the middle of this sandwich between the US and China. And I believe it was one Elcano researcher some years ago when we studied the decade of the 20s, and he said that the 21st century will be for those dominating technology. With this, I will now give the floor to our last speaker, just because of the alphabetic order, who is Fabian Sulek from the European Policy Center, who is based in our common capital, which is Brussels.
And thank you also to all the colleagues. There's a lot which has been said with which I would agree with, but I'm afraid I'm going to be rather more negative, and some of my colleagues already heard me say these kind of things. Exactly. And that's not a criticism on the Spanish presidency. It's a reflection on where we are at collectively at the European level in an incredibly challenging period. And I think this is something where we have to also reflect on the kind of solutions we're putting on the table, and to reflect on whether the kind of solutions we have now are appropriate to the scale and the scope of the challenges which we are facing. So yes, we have made progress, but I would say in many areas it is a progress illusion. We have moved forward, but at the same time, the global environment in which we are operating, the domestic environment in which we are operating, has become even more challenging than it has been before. Which means that we are still trying to address essentially exponential challenges with linear policies. And this is going to not go well much longer. I think there are some key points coming up in the next years, and I'll come back to that in a little minute. But when we're talking about open strategic autonomy, I think it's positive. We have avoided the dichotomy of the debate, and I think the Spanish presidency has done quite a bit to help us to avoid the kind of mistakes we have done in the past when we're talking about economic governance, for example, which became a very polarized debate. Because I think it is true that, of course, diversification, being open, having a wide range of different partners, different sources, is also a function of security. So these are not opposing poles which we have to consider. But I think this also relies on a global environment where trade exchanges is more or less free, where trade and exchange is not politicized, where we don't have the kind of weaponized interdependence, which unfortunately we have seen over the last, certainly since the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine. And weaponized interdependence is a feature of the world going forward. We are going to be in a situation where a variety of governments will use the economic relationships they have to promote their own political goals, whatever they might be. And that's not just autocracies, that is also democracies which are doing that. And I think the motto which we've seen under Trump, my country first, this is the motto of this age. It will be my country first across the globe. We've seen what I would say is the death of multilateralism. I'm glad that Rem still believes there's a future for multilateralism. I don't. I think it is over. The institutions of multilateralism at the global level no longer function because the two biggest economic powers have no longer an interest in making them function. We will, yes, of course, try to continue to use them, but in reality, we are now in a world where we have an absence of a global rules, global framework to operate in. We have enormous global challenges, and we haven't really mentioned climate change, and I think we have to continue to emphasize that we have an existential challenge which we are collectively not addressing. And I think Europe also has to be far more honest with itself about what we are doing internally, but also how much we can influence the rest of the world. But we're having these global challenges without any kind of global governance which can address them. In fact, we have more rivalry, more friction, more difficulties. We are having a very, very dangerous rivalry between the two superpowers, and I don't want to go into whose fault that might be or what's behind it, but in essence, we have a situation which is incredibly volatile and which will also put enormous pressures on Europe. When we're talking about economic security, one of the key questions which is going to be on the table in the near future is going to be how do we deal if there are sanctions between the two superpowers, if we are going to be asked to come down on one side or the other. Europe up to now has been trying to play both sides. It's trying to be not quite in the middle because we are very much closer to the US. But what happens if we are pushed, and extraterritoriality of US action is already something which is on the table. What happens if we have a different president, or unfortunately the same president we already had once again in the White House, with all the implications that has, because a second Trump presidency is going to be infinitely worse than a first Trump presidency. And Europe is not preparing for these challenges. We are not talking about what we are going to do in this much more difficult world with deteriorating cooperation. And with a global resource, a global race for resources and technology, which Europe is losing. And I think we also have to be far more honest about when we are looking at the cutting edge technologies, our tendency is to try to regulate them rather than trying to be at the forefront in competitiveness terms. And that is not a sustainable situation. The fact that we are nowhere on so many of the new technologies which are coming online, where often the debate is about what can we do so that we don't fall too far behind. That means that for the next generations, and this should be about the next generations, they will no longer be able to influence these global developments. If you are not at the forefront of these technologies, you will also not be able to regulate them. So we are in a very, very challenging situation. What does that mean? Well, we have to have a discussion about how we do things in Europe and what are we doing together, what are our strategic goals, and how are we going to achieve them over the next years. And that also means having a real discussion about who's going to pay for this. Because we are not going to be able to achieve everything at the same time without any cost. Economic security, and I rather talk about economic security than open strategic autonomy. Economic security is a public good. We know a public good costs money, and someone will have to pay for it. But at the moment, we are not having that debate on paying for this public good, because we are also seeing a number of other public goods which will also cost an enormous amount of money. If we look at what we have to put into hard security over the next years, if we look at what we have to put into sustainability, if we look into what we have to put into the adaptation to demographic change, which is a major impact on our economies, if we're looking at the technology investment which is needed, these are enormous amounts of money which are going to be needed. And yes, Rem is perfectly right. Of course, this is not public money alone, but it will require also a lot of public money. And that's only when we're talking about what is happening here. We will also have to rebuild Ukraine. We will have to continue to supply Ukraine with military and financial support. All of this is an enormous challenge, and we have to have a much more honest debate. And the reality is that rather than having a collective European strategic debate about where we need to go, we are shying away from this because domestic politics has become so difficult in every country. So we now all have what I call the British disease, which is essentially that we know what we ought to be doing, but we can't sell it to domestic populations anymore. So we're not making any progress on key areas where we should be making progress. That's a rather bleak picture, but I think that we have to start from brutal honesty. We have to start from a situation where we acknowledge that we have to start doing things together, which we haven't done together before. A common industrial policy was mentioned before, absolutely. But that also means transferring money to the European level. It means that we have to address that one country in Europe, and that happens to be the country I am from, spends 50% of state aids, and we are doing nothing about it. These are the kind of realities where, unfortunately, what I'm seeing at the moment is rather the opposite of doing things together. We are actually threatening the common things we have already achieved. We're threatening the common market. We're threatening the integration. Schengen is under threat. All of the things which we have actually built are starting to become rather vulnerable to this situation because we are not facing to the realities for the next years. So I commend the Spanish presidency for starting that debate, but I think we have to also recognize that we are a long way from putting the things into place which we need to do to really address this Zeitenwende and to get to the point where we can go to the next generation and say we did what we needed to do.
Dankeschön. Dankeschön. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias por su...
Thank you very much for this brutal honesty. Well, it's a bit like we have to do this and this and this, but then you come here and you tell us, all right, we have to move away from this. And again, listening to you, and this is something you partly mentioned, the Trump question, what if in 11 months the United States citizens decide to re-elect not Biden, but to re-elect Donald Trump? And everything points at this direction that Trump, from our perspective and from our interest, is going to be very negative. And adding to this, I'm coming back to what we said in the beginning, the political trends underlying this British disease that you were mentioning, this sovereignty, growing sovereignty. On the one hand side, you all mentioned that we need a common effort. On the other hand side, in all countries, we see more and more powers saying, let's come back to our national interests. The 4 participants, well, I cannot see Rem very well, but I guess you all took notes. And now we have 15 minutes for an exchange. You can exchange your impressions based on the notes you've been taking about what others have just mentioned. So you have the floor. I could see you were taking notes. Maybe, Sarah, you can start. Well, I think there are several questions. I will kindly ask you to be brief because the audience will also like to participate. Of course, no problem. I think there are some aspects that may be worth mentioning. And in this list that Miguel was preparing, which are some of the levers that we have identified in order to improve internal production capabilities and basically to have a better relative position in certain areas, I believe that there's still one more thing to say, which Fabian said. How can we reinforce the common market, the functioning of the common market? I think this is a major topic because having a single market that is more integrated, larger and stronger will enable us 2 things. First, generating scale economies in these new production capabilities that we want to create and reinforce Europe's role as a generator of a brand generator. Establishing criteria, establishing standards, establishing values in production lines, in service provision, apart from regulations. Here there's an aspect, for example, in some areas it is very relevant, which is how can we reinforce 2 lines. First, interconnections, which is an important topic. We could see this, how important it is to play with this excess and deficiencies amongst the different countries and improve these interconnections. For example, in the energy sector is super relevant. And in other types of decisions such as common procurement, Europe going together and having common procurement processes will give us a better room for maneuver when we want to negotiate and buy something. And this sovereignty perspective will lead us to lose these synergies that are arising from the common market. Another element that Miguel was mentioning, and I think we are not focusing enough, is human capital. I always say that there is no reindustrialization if we do not have the task force. And I believe Europe needs to really reflect on this aspect, mainly because we are realizing that there are some sectors, some industries that are going to be really state-of-the-art, but they find a lack of qualified personnel. And one last element, which will be a side note to this conversation, and that has to do with financing. In the end, Fabian, Rem, and Miguel already explained the old problems that Europe usually has. Whenever we get to a more strategic reflection, they come on the table. We did so in 2008, in 2012, after the war, with this capacity for financing to compete with the US and China. The way that we can involve the private sector is crucial. We cannot only think that the EU from the public funds is going to be enough to compete with cloud, etc., other technologies without having an important stake of private capital is going to be really difficult, especially in the short term. And the last reflection is what happens if Trump comes back. There's a lot of, words, but data and trade relations may be going somewhere else when we evaluate these more protectionist discourses or speech. And what they say is that the US and China have negotiated and traded goods that are not subject to tariffs, and this has just taken place in very specific elements.
And there's a series of dynamics that have been created, and the US is doing an important effort in terms of diversification together with other Asian countries. But I think that the two blocs, maybe not outspokenly, but maybe de facto, the US and China will very difficultly take us into a strong deglobalization dynamics, because the complexity of value chains is what it is. And I read the other day that US doesn't want to buy some active principles from China, and they're doing it with Vietnam and India, and actually these countries are improving, are changing the flow, so precisely with China. So it's much more complex than just adopting a position in which you say, okay, I will close my borders and not trade with China. It's a scenario that's not favorable for Europe or the rest of the world, I think. And now talking about how Fabian called it polycrisis or multi-crisis, polycrisis, right? We're constantly facing up to different types of challenges. Firstly, we ran out of masks, gloves, and protective equipment for our healthcare workers. It's difficult to calculate how many people have actually died because of us lacking that capacity. And then we've also had supply issues caused by the pandemic, and then again by the sanctions on Russia. Sanctions that, by the way, almost 2 years after, Russia is also managing to dodge in a way. In February, it'll be 2 years after the beginning of the war, and there's no lack of supply in Russian. I read that on the New York Times. There's technological players, the technological components that cannot officially import from the United States, but they still have access to them, and they still have access to them to use them in the FSB machinery, the Secret Service in Russia. So that's an additional crisis. It looks like for a while no more goods will go through the Red Seas because the big container carriers, BP, joined this initiative yesterday, and many others will. And who knows what else can happen? The Spanish presidency began in July, and we didn't really know what was going to happen. We didn't know that Hamas was going to commit the atrocities that it committed, and then that Israel would respond as it has. So those polycrises can become even more more questions or more interventions. Yes, I actually wanted to go back to what Fabian said on Trump, and Anna, you mentioned it too. We must remember that with the first Trump, we sparked a discussion on strategic autonomy. It wasn't China, it was actually Trump. And the issues with the NATO started arising, and from the strategic perspective of defense, they started discussing this. And I remember being here precisely discussing that Brexit and Trump were federalizing vectors for Europe. And we sometimes think that we need a shock. We're more reactive than proactive in Europe, aren't we? Yes, I think we are indeed, but maybe because we're in a more comfortable position than others are. We have high-level standards still, and something needs to happen for us to react. In a forum recently, someone from Balkan countries said that with the issue with Ukraine, we have Russia with war machinery, and we're discussing whether we need to put another 50 billion into that. And they were saying that maybe Europe would need a Pearl Harbor. That's a lot to say, but for some, Europe needs a shock of that kind. Maybe Trump would be a shock. That's the kind of shock that's needed. And maybe that would help us understand the severity of the situation, as Fabian explained. And maybe if we are separated, we won't be able to deal with different challenges. I'm going to give the floor to Fabian, but before that, I'm going to give the floor to Rem, because he's not here physically, and sometimes we have a hard time seeing him raise his hand, and he raised it a while ago.
To add, to comment, to ask?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. And I think it's very interesting discussion. Just 3 very quick observations. I don't disagree with anything that has been said. In fact, I think that this has been a very complimentary, deep exploration of the problem. I don't disagree also with Fabian's sort of rather gloomy picture, but I think the bottom line for me is we shouldn't be naive about how the world is changing and about how we are now in an era of weaponized interdependence. But we also shouldn't be depressed in the sense that we should simply accept the situation and believe that we as Europe are the victim of these larger trends. Of course, we're subject to them, but we're not alone. I mean, conversations like this are happening in Tokyo, in Ottawa, in Delhi, in Singapore. These are countries with which we can actually work to ensure that when elephants dance, as they say, the great powers, as the US and China geopolitical competition picks up, that the grass, which is us, doesn't suffer. And so there are connections that we can build on with other like-minded countries that aren't the United States. And I think this is key. And I do think that the EU has been investing in this. I think it's also important to realize that open strategic autonomy started because of Trump. It didn't start because of concerns about China or about Russia per se. It started because there was a realization in 2017 that there were a number of developments taking place with extraterritoriality of sanctions or dependencies or exposure to the U.S. economy that the U.S. and under Trump was weaponizing and was really creating a sense of urgency in European circles, and that sense of urgency has dissipated. And that's, Fabian is right. It's not going quick enough. I really like what Fabian said, that we're looking at linear solutions to exponential problems. And this is a problem. And we need to invest much more heavily in establishing that sense of urgency. But that brings me to that final point. And this is also something that Fabian reflected on, which is the costs element. The costs of Europe getting to grips with this age of economic security are going to be enormous. And we're not having an honest conversation about the costs involved. And that's exactly why I keep coming back to, well, let's not try to throw away multilateralism just yet, because multilateral solutions are in a way the most cost-efficient way to dealing with some of these problems. So again, let's not be naive, but let's also not throw away the baby with the bathwater just yet. And yes, we need to think about unilateral action and the things that Europe needs to do by itself, and at the same time be a realistic